Hi, everybody. David Knorr. I want to welcome you back to another episode of the Curve Benders Live. I got to tell you, I'm elated to be joined by a esteemed kind of executive, one of those people that you kind of read about for a long time, then you feel blessed to get a chance to meet and get to know. Harry Kraemer is joining me. Harry, welcome.
Great to be with you, David. Always great.
It is great to have you. Harry, for those that may not know as much about you, can you share a little background about where you've been and what you've done professionally to date?
Sure. I actually went to Northwestern, the Kellogg School. I went to Baxter Healthcare. I always say went there for 2 years. I forgot to leave, and I was there for 24 years, going different divisions. I was the CFO. I was the chairman and CEO. And then I had the opportunity when I left Baxter to come back to Kellogg. So I'm a professor at Kellogg at the business school, teaching leadership, values, and ethics. And I spent half my time at Madison Dearborn, a private equity firm based in Chicago, not doing the deals, but my role is basically to be on board. So I'm one of these board guys, David, who, believe it or not, I'm on 10 boards, 3 public companies, 3 private companies, and 4 nonprofits. And I love teaching so much. The main reason, David, I do the boards, it gives me an infinite amount of material to use when I teach. I just have to change the names to protect the innocent and the guilty.
Love that. So what, and I'd love to jump into that. And for our audience, would love to have you likewise jump in. We're live on Facebook and LinkedIn and YouTube and Twitter. Jump in with your questions for Harry. So let's talk about Madison Dearborn. What attracted you to them? And these 10 boards, as I understand, there's some private, there's some public, there's some nonprofit. Talk about what you're seeing from that governance and that stewardship, Harry, in the last 14 months that's really resonated with you.
Yeah. Sure. So Madison Dearborn, as I mentioned, based in Chicago, what attracted me to Madison Dearborn, maybe it's sort of the Midwest thing. Maybe it was, this is one of those private equity firms that actually realized that as private equity people, they know a lot about finance, but it really is good to get operating people that know how to run things. And on all of their boards, they end up putting operating people to really help the CEOs rather than, hey, we're taking over. And that's been the reputation. I went there, I thought, for 3 or 4 months 15 years ago, and I've been there for 15 years. So they're just great people. I really, really enjoy the environment, and I focus on healthcare. What I would say, Chief, in terms of the last 14 months, as you can imagine, with all the work that you do, if anybody who thought that it all didn't come down to people, they've really learned that it all comes down to people, okay? You can talk about having the financial resources, but if you're not developing leaders that understand how to motivate people, train people, and deal with what I call the three C's, change, controversy, and crisis, it's not going to be really successful.
So is that also, does that carry over to what you teach at Kellogg? Are you bringing that same attributes, those same characteristics that you see across the board in these boards into the kind of that next generation of leaders?
Absolutely, David. Absolutely. I'm trying to be, I'm not an academic, so I'm trying to bring the practical reality of what is it like to deal with a lot of change? What is it like to deal with the ability to deal with crisis? Not if, but when the crisis is going to occur. And how do you motivate people? How do you develop? How do you make sure that, in a Zoom world, you're staying connected enough with people that you understand the whole person, because they're the people who are going to drive the results and make things happen. So I find it incredibly helpful, and the students, I think, appreciate it a lot.
One of the things I appreciate from Kellogg is this clinical professor role, because you're not after tenure, you're after bringing that realistic background and experiences to these students, and I love that type of a position. Yeah. Harry, talk about those 3 C's. What are you highlighting for them? And you could take each one of them if you want.
Sure.
What are you highlighting for them as critical to think about? And I'm particularly thinking about this post-pandemic world, right? As we come back to work, as we come back to office environments, as we really think about leading differently, what about change? What about controversy or crisis do you believe that really stands out?
Yeah. So, David, you always ask great questions. What I always tease folks, and I'll mention to your listeners, I always try to get people to think about change really in terms of where are they on the continuum, right? And I literally start off on one end, David, and say, okay, you got people who hate change. And then they're a little bit better. They react to change. Well, then they accept change. Then they encourage change. And then the people that are really, really the winners, as you well know, they're the people that create the change that other people have to react to, right? And I often tease the students, having met the late Steve Jobs and Bill Gates at some CEO meetings, I always tease them, can you picture either of those two guys in a room talking about how they're going to react to what other people are doing? No, they're going to create what other people have to react to. And we talk a lot in classes, Chief, and a lot with executives is, why is it change so hard for people? What do you do to become more proactive? And they'll say, well, I've got some concerns. What if we fail? Well, as you know, David, when do you learn the most? When you fail. If you're not failing, you're not taking risk enough, right? And often I'll meet with executives and they'll say, well, Harry, I know you did this a lot at Baxter, but I'm having trouble getting people to be willing to take a risk. And I'll say, well, let me talk to the last 3 people who took a risk. And let's talk about it. Well, Harry, none of those people are still with the company. All right, well, maybe we know why there's no one taking a risk, right? So it becomes really important, Chief. Very, very important.
So do the same thing on controversy and crisis. What are the critical things to think about in each of those?
Yeah, well, and this one, David, I think you're one of the experts in. When I was running Baxter, 15 years ago, if there was a controversy, I had the time, think about it, get people in a room, to take a couple days to figure it out. Well, as you well know, my friend, you got to be able to move instantaneously. You wait more than 10 seconds, it's blown all over the world. So how do you move faster? How do you make sure that you're being able to react as quickly as you possibly can? And I literally will tell people that as soon as you know there's an issue, immediately, like a little 3-step process, David, tell people what you know, tell people what you don't know, and tell people how quickly you'll get back to them with what you don't know. Mm-hmm. So the model is flipped from when I would have grown up. And the faster, the better, and be very open and be very vulnerable and get back to people very, very quickly.
I also believe, Harry, people make things up when there's absence of information. So if you don't share with them exactly what you said, what you don't, what you know, what you don't know, and when should I know something, you're diminishing that need to fill the void with information I don't have, right?
Well said, David. And if you happen to believe, as I do, that the entire leadership model that I use, David, is 3 words: leadership, influence, relate. Okay, since leadership has nothing to do with titles and organizational charts, okay, I think it all comes down, my friend, to the ability to influence people. And the only way I know how to influence people is you have to be able to relate to people, right? So if I can relate to you, David, and I think you and I relate together very well, maybe I can influence you and maybe I can lead you. And to your point, being a little vulnerable really helps because, to your point, people say, oh, well, I don't want to admit that I don't know. And I say, wait a minute. If it's leadership, influence, relate, how do you relate to people who know everything? How do you relate to people that never make a mistake, right? So the more open you are and the quicker you are, the better you're going to be.
For our audience, if you've just joined us, you're listening to Harry Kraemer, former CEO, chairman of Baxter, and now a clinical professor at Kellogg at Northwestern University. I would encourage you to jump in with your questions. I would love to ask Harry about, I think, he's more than open from his broad spectrum of experiences to what he's seeing now. So talk about the same on crisis. What are the things that's really important for leaders to think about in terms of crisis?
Yeah, and I'd love to get your thought on this, David, and see whether this makes sense, because I try to simplify everything, right? You and I always try to say, let's take the complexity out of it. And in terms of crisis, the way I teach this, the way I think about it, a lot of my lessons from Baxter and Madison Dearborn is, it isn't a question of if, it's a question of when. Right. So now there's going to be crisis. There is. And if you're self-reflective, you may not know when it's going to happen, but you know what? It will happen. And so how do you deal with it? And what I decided a long time ago, as you and I have talked in the past, is I'll say, all right, when there's a crisis, what am I going to do? And I encourage the students to say, come up with theirs. Here's mine. When there's a crisis, I know what I'll do. Number 1, I'll try to do the right thing with a lot of people's help. And number 2, I'll do the best I can do. I'll try to do the right thing. I'll do the best I can do. And David, it becomes just a way of thinking so that when it occurs, rather than getting involved in worry, fear, anxiety, pressure, and stress, no, try to do the right thing. We'll do the best we can do. And it turns out, David, that sometimes we'll say, well, how seriously do you look at that? And this may sound a little morbid, but you and I are talking today. You and I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know about you, but if you said, Harry, what's the worst case for you tomorrow? Well, something happens to my wife, Julie, or something happens to one of my 5 children. I hope it doesn't happen. I'll pray it doesn't happen. I'll do what I can. But if it happens, David, I know what I'll do. I'll try to do the right thing. I'll do the best I can do. Worry, fear, anxiety, pressure, stress can be reduced. Can't be eliminated. Welcome to the real world.
Are you at all surprised, Harry, by how woefully underprepared so many leaders, so many organizations seemed at the onset of this pandemic? I think it's fascinating how we've learned to maneuver based on the information we had available. But it seemed like this, we knew what a pandemic was. We'd seen it before.
Right.
We didn't realize that the depth or the impact of this. But does that really surprise you of just how many people were caught off guard?
Yeah, well, absolutely, Chief. It amazes me that, as you well know, you teach this stuff as well. As leaders, okay, being prepared, realizing anything can happen, talking about, and if it does happen, what are we going to happen, rather than waiting until it occurs, right? I mean, the example I would use at Baxter, you got plants all over the world. Well, guess what? There's chemicals in all these plants. We'll have audits. We'll have compliance. We'll have regulatory. We're going to be really prepared. But we know at some point in time there's going to be a fire someplace. Okay, so rather than, oh my God, there's a fire, what are we going to do? Well, we know what we're going to do. All right, we thought about it. And to your point, this isn't the first pandemic we've had. Okay, and several people, including Bill Gates, were telling us 10 years ago, it isn't a question of if, it's a question of when. But sort of this inability to think ahead, this inability to prepare. And I think this inability to balance short and long term, which, as you well know, is one of the diseases we have, that people get so focused on the short term, they're not thinking about the long term.
One of the things, whether it's change, controversy, crisis, Harry, I think you and I agree on, is the courage to act. Where do you believe that courage comes from? And how do we nurture more of that courage in maybe perhaps not the utmost senior leaders, but really the next level, to be able to say something of, listen, this might be a lab or a wet market in China, but it's going to have a ripple effect. Maybe we should proactively look into this. How do you build that courage?
Yeah, I'm smiling, David, because this is like right out of my classes, because I'm literally trying to get more people to do exactly what you're saying. And I boil it down to those 4 principles that you and I've talked about in the past, right? How do I take somebody? I mean, if you were one of my students, okay, how do I get you to be, number 1, more self-reflective, self-aware, knowing yourself? How do I get you, number 2, to be more balanced, have a balanced perspective, understand multiple perspectives rather than just your own? Number 3, how to have true self-confidence, right? You know what you know what you don't know, you're willing to be vulnerable, you admit you're going to get people brighter than you are, not to be offended by that, but to know the more good people you have. And then number 4, genuine humility, realizing every single person matters. And I find, Chief, if I can find people that realize leadership isn't a destination, it's a journey. And on that journey, if I can become more self-reflective, more balanced, develop true self-confidence and genuine humility, I can have the courage, as you just said, to make the changes that we need to. That's what I'm trying to develop at Kellogg.
Love it. You've also, in your own humility, Harry, you've written 3 best-selling books. I want to know what your secret is at some point. But I'd love to learn about the most recent one. I think it's
I love Curve Benders, by the way, because that was one of the books I've read that I really enjoyed. So let's leave that one on the list for sure.
Very kind. I appreciate your kindness. Let's talk about 168 hours. Where did the idea come from? Why are you so passionate about this topic? Because it absolutely jumps off the page that your energy and passion about this topic. Talk about where the idea came from and the gist of it for our audience.
Yeah, so it almost be fun, David, to kind of guess how many of your listeners know why 168 is a critical number. It turns out about one out of 20 people know it. I mean, most people don't. But when you say to people, how hard are you working? They'll usually say, how hard am I working? I'm working 24/7. And maybe because I was a math guy, but you multiply 24 times 7, you carry the 2 like you and I were in 5th grade, you usually get 168. And I get kind of excited, David. You and I are pretty animated, but we've only got 168 hours. That's all you got. That's what you got. And so when people realize that's the amount of time you got, and how do you want to think about that across your career, your education, your family, your spirituality, your health, a little exercise, a little bit of sleep, a little bit of fun, and then realizing, David, we're here for a blink of an eye. And how can we have an impact on the world the short time we're passing through? And if you're not aware of where you're spending your time, welcome to chaos, right? And I'd often tease people because sometimes I'll say, oh, hey, Joe, do you want to have lunch? And they'll say, well, Harry, I just don't have the time. No, Joe, you have the time. You got 168 hours. Now, if I'm not a priority, that's okay, pal. That's okay. But you got 168 hours. And somebody says to me, well, I just don't have the time to exercise. Well, is it important to you? Is your health important? You're not trying to figure out something about a sprint here. We're living a marathon. So how are you pacing yourself? So no matter what the topic, I realize it has a lot to do with what are you going to do and what are you not going to do? And I'm sure, David, you see this a lot in your work.
You're exactly right. And I use, again, Harry, a page out of some of my conversations when somebody says, well, I just don't have the time. I come back with that's clearly not important enough, because right. when your wife or my wife says we got to be somewhere at 3:00 on Wednesday afternoon, typically that's where we are. Right. So talk about, and I got to tell you, I was fascinated by your comment that not only you don't watch TV, but you haven't for Harry, 20 some odd years.
Yeah, 30 years. Yeah.
So talk about this. Talk about how do you, I guess, prioritize. Yeah. And this is the reason I bring this up is I think, and I would welcome your comment, Harry, I think this pandemic has pushed restart for a lot of us on what's really important to us. And, whether it's that hour and a half or 3-hour commute, or I was on the road 208 days in 2019. That just doesn't sound that exciting to me again. And I love my clients and I love the work, but I'm not convinced I want to leave my wife and kids to go do that. So talk about the fact that you don't watch TV. Talk about how do you prioritize kind of the things that are important to you?
Yeah. Well, again, David, you ask great questions, because what I find is because we're in a rush, because there's so many things to do, and this typical people with your energy level or my energy level, well, we'll just go faster and faster. This is where the multitasking kicks in, right? And then we got these devices, right? Blackberries, Blueberries, iPhones, and this whole idea of we'll just go faster and faster. And I always ask folks to stop a minute and ask, have we confused activity and productivity? We're very active, okay? But how productive are we? Or, David, are we moving so fast we have no idea how productive we are? Let's just keep moving. And I really do believe the key to all of this is to be self-reflective, turn off the noise, turn off the gadgets for a short amount of time, and ask some of those questions. What are my values? What's my purpose? No kidding around. What really matters? And I think when you start to do that, you start to say, okay, well, wait a minute. If my family's important, I better spend a lot of time with them. You and I were talking about our children. They go from 0 to 18, and all of a sudden they're off to college. And people will say, oh, geez, that happened pretty quickly. Well, no, it did take 18 years, okay? Now, the fact that you didn't take the time and you're surprised, right? And as we always tease, one of the great benefits of this self-reflection, it minimizes the surprise. But there's an amazing, David, there's an amazing number of very surprised people walking around, and you wonder, why are you surprised? Why are you surprised? And now, the television thing, well, Julie literally said to me, Harry, what do we say we're going to do for an hour, and we're doing it for 3 or 4 hours? And I said, I don't know, television. And she said, well, I think we should stop. I was a little defensive, David. I said, wait a minute, I need the news. I need to get from the roots to the trees to the forest. And she said, Harry, you read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Economist. Harry, by the time you turn the news on, it's the only thing you didn't know was, Jojo the giraffe escaped from the zoo. Okay. You knew everything else. And it turns out it's actually true. So by not watching television, you save a lot of time. And then you decide, okay, by the way, one of the buckets is fun, so I go to the movies. The great news is you go to the movies, Chief, after an hour and 52 minutes or whatever, the screen closes. Okay, they're collecting the popcorn. I'm not tempted, I can't stay any longer, right? So this is not about not having fun. It's a question of what are you going to do and what are you not going to do? And really, Chief, being aware of where you're spending your time, which, interestingly enough, and give you examples, an amazing number of bright people don't even know where they're spending their time.
So again, I was taken back by your comment that somebody said, well, don't you miss sports? And it's like, wait, I don't have time to kind of exercise myself. Why would I want to watch other people exercise?
Exactly.
Great expression. So in our podcast conversation, you and even today in this session, you talked a lot about the correlation between making time for that self-reflection and a set of personal values and kind of what do you value? What do you believe in? What's that purpose? What drives you? I often say what lights a fire within you to kind of help you get, through the obstacles, through the challenges, and not just accomplish, but really become the leader you aspire to become. You talk about values-based leadership. Talk a minute about what that means and why it's so important, particularly in this post-pandemic era.
Yeah. So key, Chief. What I really do believe is that when you think about all the problems that we've got, whether it's racial issues, whether it's sexual harassment, whether it's whatever, people are surprised. They're surprised. And I think the reason they're surprised is that they don't take the time ahead of time to figure out what their values are. And let me run this by you, David. You can tell me whether this makes sense to you. Oftentimes, executives will say, well, how should I think about values? And I'll say, well, the first thing maybe to separate is the difference between values and preferences. And so if you and I are working together, David, I may say, hey, David, you know what? Let's just decide, we're not going to swear. We're not going to use 4-letter words. Now, if you do, okay, I'm not going to fire you. I'm just telling you I prefer. That's kind of like a preference. But if it's a value, two things in my mind line up. Number one, we're not going to compromise them. And number two, they're not negotiable. Because I've actually decided, Chief, if I can compromise them, or I'm willing to figure out a way to negotiate, well, then I don't know what it is, but it's not a value, right? And if you think about what happens in life, and you see this from your clients, you'll see people, there'll be some sexual harassment issue, and they'll be, well, maybe he didn't mean it, or, well, he's 130% the plan, so, well, wait a minute, look, so it's okay if you're 130% the plan? And guess what? People are surprised. Well, why not just say, hey, David, we're working together. I'm sure this won't happen, David. I'm sure this will never happen. I'm positive. But by the way, pal, if it happens, you're gone. We don't even have to have a discussion, okay? Because you lay it out. And I have this little 4-step thing I always try to teach, Chief. Number one, you set a clear expectation. Number two, you communicate it over and over and over again. That's 3 overs, David, because the average person needs to hear something 3 times before they've heard it. Julie tells me until she's told me something 10 times. I haven't heard it. That's my own personal problem. Number 3, you'll hold people accountable. And number 4, there's consequences, both positive and negative. And I find it fascinating, David, and I'm sure with all your clients, when do people really get frustrated, even though they like their job? When do they get really frustrated? And I decided they get frustrated because they make assumptions. And you know that expression of what happens when you make assumptions, right? And so I decided a long time ago, I'm out of the assumption business. Let's set a clear expectation. Let's communicate it over and over and over again. We'll hold one another accountable, and I'm accountable as well, right? And there's going to be consequences. And you as well know there are some leaders, unfortunately, they're really good at setting the expectation for others, but then it's like it doesn't apply to them. Well, how does that work? Okay, that's where I say you will not compromise and you will not negotiate.
So I got to ask you, human nature, right? So what I've learned over the years that I know you're masterful as well is that common sense isn't common behavior, isn't common action. This makes so much sense. Harry, I could go borderline and say that's right? That just no brainer, right? That makes a whole lot of sense. Have a set of values that are non-negotiable. We're not going to compromise on these, and be crystal clear with these 4 steps. My probably $1 million question of you, thinking about your days at Baxter, think about your 10 boards, think about, Harry, the life you lead. Why do you believe this is so difficult for leaders to consistently commit to, consistently show up and incorporate this into their brand as a leader, into how they show up and how they lead?
Yeah. So, David, I just love talking to you because you ask the best questions. I get so excited about this. There are, in my mind, having, without mentioning names, being business roundtables and knowing the top 200 guys or whatever, and I won't mention names, but I can visualize the issues that you're talking about so clearly. You got 2 problems, okay? Number one, as you well know, very few. I mean, if you said to me, how many people practice what I talk about? No more than 20% on a good day, all right? Because what it requires, David, it requires 2 things. It requires you to take the time to literally, whether it's on a nightly basis, whether it's a weekly basis, to actually ask those questions, right? Literally, what did I say I was going to do today? What did I do? What am I proud of? What am I not proud of? How did I lead people? How did I follow people? If I lived today over again, what would I have done differently? And if I have tomorrow, knowing sooner or later I won't, based on what I learned today, how will I operate differently? If you're not asking yourself those questions, if you're not pushing yourself, that's problem number 1. Problem number 2, David, as you well know, you can't just do this by yourself, right? As my wife Julie will say to me, hey, Harry, left to your own devices, you could convince yourself of anything. Do you want to know what I think? Well, after 41 years, Chief, the answer better be yes, okay? Or I'm in a world of hurt. I don't know about you.
Yeah.
And then the last one. The higher you go up, David, you know this, these are your clients, the higher you go up, there's enough people starting to say, hey, Harry, you're amazing. Hey, Harry, you're fantastic. If you're not careful and you don't surround yourself with people who knew you before you became a big shot, you start to believe your own press clippings, all right? And that becomes a real problem. So living in a bubble, just listening to yourself talk as opposed to, hey, wait a minute, you know what? Maybe, yeah, I worked hard, but you know what? If it wasn't for luck, if it wasn't for timing, if it wasn't for the team, if it wasn't for some of these mentors, and for some of us, if it wasn't for a spiritual perspective, there's no way I would have been in this job. Every single person matters. And the reason I say genuine humility as the fourth principle is you and I both know, David, there's a lot of people will say everybody's important. But then you watch what they do and you realize it's just a bunch of double talk, okay? And actually taking the time. In fact, David, I'm so focused on getting people to think about this value-based leadership and genuine humility. What I've been doing lately, I've been saying in front of a group, in front of 200 people the other night, I said, all right, well, I got everybody on the screen. How many of you really want to be leaders? Right? And everybody raised their hand. How many of you think you relate really well to people? Everybody raises their hand. I said, all right, now, before you raise your hand this time, I don't embarrass anybody. When you walk in the building, how many of you know the name of the receptionist? How many of you know the names of the people in the cafeteria and how many children they have? And the maintenance guy, do you know what his favorite sport team is? And if it turns out you got 2 extra tickets to a Cub game, do you say to yourself, I go quite often, I'm going to give them to that guy? All right? Because as you well know, David, these are the people who make this place run. These are the people who care. And by the way, for me, and this is not just a talk, if it wasn't for, literally, wasn't for luck, timing, the team, mentors, and the man upstairs, I could easily be part of the cleaning crew. That's not some bizarre view. I mean, I don't know about how you grew up, David, but you and I are pretty blessed. We're pretty fortunate, all right? So how do you make sure that you realize that, you're thankful for that, and you lead in a way that people say, hey, you know what? He's just like us. He's just like us.
I coach a lot of, thank you for that, Harry. I coach a lot of leaders in what I think your parents and my parents, did just naturally, which is genuinely recognize and appreciate and engage every single person they met. And this idea that everybody matters is, you're exactly right, is all the people that go unthanked or just even, under recognized throughout the day that make the place run, it becomes critical. I had a chance to meet A.G. Lafley once, and I love his comment about he would fly into a city and without an entourage, he would go shopping with a mom, right? And he wanted to see how that mom with the kids in the cart went up and down each aisle of the grocery store and how they shopped. And then he would go meet with the team and all that stuff. But that humility to stay so connected to that ultimate end customer, I think is just as relevant to those employees each and every day, predominantly because you and I have seen the news get filtered as it comes up the ranks, right?
Absolutely.
So talk about post-pandemic. What are some of the trends you've observed in the last 14 months that you believe are going to have a profound impact in how leaders should lead moving forward?
Yeah, super, David. I actually think as terrible as this situation has been, people say to me, I get so many every day, you probably as well, hey, Harry, how are you doing? And I'll say, well, how am I doing? Let me reflect on it a minute. How am I doing? Well, 3.5 million people have died around the world, 588,000 Americans as of yesterday, and 20 million Americans are out of work or under them. How am I doing? Pretty blessed. How do people like you and I, David, help the people that are a lot less fortunate than we are? Now, with all of those issues, every time, as you know, there's a crisis, there's some good sides to it. I mean, you and I, let's face it, have had breakfast, lunch, and dinner more with our family in the last 14 months than the previous 14 years combined, okay? Talking about them, understanding their life, understanding what happens. I think we've better appreciated the difference between activity and productivity, right? So before I jump on a plane for a 3-hour meeting in San Francisco, they say, wait a minute, maybe we could do that on Zoom. Maybe, okay? Maybe. Now, as you and I both know, my friend, second principle, balance. There's something about being together. I wish you and I were in the same room together right now. I could hug you. We could shake hands. Now, but this works pretty well. And when you talk about the differences, let's think about some of the economic differences, Chief. I've had several boards. And the average board, as you probably know, meets, 6 times a year for a day and a half. Important. You got to be together. You need to meet the management teams, visit facilities. But 3 boards have already said, you know what? Why don't we start doing that instead of 6 times a year, twice a year, and 4 times a year, we'll do it on Zoom. Think of that concept, Chief, from 6 to 2. That is a 66% reduction in airfare, hotels, board dinners, taxi cabs, Uber, Link, whatever. The impact of this is going to be significant, right? And so when people say, oh, we're going to get back, well, there'll be a partial back, but I think people are going to ask themselves, how is this going to work? And for you and I in the world we're in, you better become a lot more people-oriented, okay? When I talk to you as part of my team, it isn't going to be, okay, hey, tell me what the numbers look like for May so far, David. The first conversation ought to be, David, how are you doing? How's your wife doing? And by the way, I think you're like in a 1-bedroom apartment, and your wife's also working, right? So you got a 7 and a 9-year-old. How are they doing? Okay, and how's your dad doing in Iran? He's in his 80s. I mean, if you can't relate to people, forget it. Forget it. And a lot of these companies now that are saying, oh, you know what? We're gonna just continue to be remote. Well, let's talk about you continue to be remote, but how do you develop people? How do you lead people? How do you think about how you're going to operate in a world that's very, very different than this? Oh, that was just very, very temporary. And I think the focus on people development and values, I think will become exponential, which is one of the reasons you and I are doing what we're doing.
Absolutely. So it sounds like you're a big proponent of this hybrid work model of, work from home for, 2-3 days a week, come in for 2-3 days a week. Harry, I just wrote a blog post about some critical talent trends. One of which I wrote, I believe, is going to be I call it the Great Resignation. And it's a lot of folks who have reflected over the last 14 months, realize that there's more that I want in the life and the time that I have left than that grind, whether, again, it was a commute or just the travel, whatever. So I'm looking now for other options. I'm looking maybe I've been a vice president. Now I'm going to go buy a franchise. So now I'm more local, and I may work different hours or more flexible hours. So talk about the opportunity for organizations to attract, retain, develop the right kind of talent moving forward. So what are some of the things they're going to have to think about? What are some of the things you're advising some of the boards you're on to think about when it comes to talent? Because you and I are, again, no argument. It is critical. It's going to even become more critical. What are you suggesting that they think about or do differently?
A lot of this, great questions, David. I wish we had 10 hours to talk about some of this stuff, and I want to give short answers, but I love this one for hours. A lot of this, Chief, really comes down to this whole balance concept, because I think we've got to figure out a way, my friend, and I know you're doing this in your work. We've got to figure out a way to help people understand and think about this in a balanced way, because we kind of gyrate from one extreme to another, and we don't look at it in a balance. So in my mind, a good example, a lot of people now say, well, we have to throw out this shareholder thing, right? It's all about the stakeholder, and let's not worry about return. And I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a minute, what is it? Do I focus on the team? I don't use the word employee, but do I focus on the team, customers, society, shareholders? I mean, what do I do? And of course, I tease my students, David, any question I ask, if you answer yes, you get partial credit. The answer is always yes. So how do you do that? And I think unless you understand, it really is a balance, right? It's like when we say, well, we're not going to focus on shareholder value anymore. Well, think about it, okay? If Baxter's stock is trading for $50, the only reason people bought it is because they would like to retire someday. They like to put their kids through college. Okay, they like to buy a home. Now, okay, then I just focus on the share. No, well, how do you generate shareholder value? And then I realized with the students, wait a minute, okay, how do I generate shareholder value? Well, to your point, I got to have great people. Well, great people, I'm sure your children, my 5 children, they're not going to work for an organization that isn't being focused on the environment, that isn't focused on making a difference. So if I focus on a difference and I'm socially responsible, I can attract a great team. Then I say, all right, what else do I need? Well, I need customers. Okay, so David, you're a customer. You can buy the product from me or Joe. Now, Harry, I'm just focused on shareholder value. That's all I care about. Now, Joe, but he's socially responsible. He's doing the right thing. He's doing Habitat for Humanity. I got to believe you're probably going to buy the product from Joe. So I try to tease the students. I love your comment before. Common sense is not common. Here's a real simple equation. If by doing the right thing, all the things you and I believe in, and we're socially responsible, we'll generate a great team, we'll have great customers, and guess what? We'll probably generate shareholder value. So this whole idea of it's got to be all of the above, not which extreme are you on? And almost any topic today, David, everybody wants to be at an extreme.
So let's talk about that a second. Love the balanced approach. Harry, what do you do when a group of employees' values are not aligned with where the organization is or where it's going? So, for example, without naming names, let's say the organization is pursuing some sort of a government contract, some sort of a security space, and the employees, based on their personal values, based on they believe in free speech, they believe in certain privacy rights, and there's this new movement of employee activism, right? So we, as your biggest asset, the talent in the organization, strenuously object to you pursuing that customer or that customer segment. Where do we draw the line? Where do we, you can't stop that freedom of speech at the office doors. By the same token, we have a customer. We have an obligation to serve those customers and those shareholders that own our stock. What happens to your balance formula where there's an inherent conflict between those values?
Yeah. So here's the way I think about it. And thank goodness, David, I always say I have very, very, very few answers, but I have many opinions, right? I should have said up front, I don't do Q&A, I do Q&O. These are all opinions. And it comes back, David, it's a great one. It comes back for me to that little equation I gave you before. Setting clear expectations, communicating, holding one another accountable, and consequences. And what do I mean by that? In the first meeting, David, when we start with the company, we're going to talk about how we're going to make decisions. And I'm going to openly say to you, David, I'm just pretending you're one of my team. Hey, David, you know what? I respect you so much that before I make a decision, I want to understand your view. I want to understand your perspective. I will seek to understand before I'm understood, before I make a decision. But I will let you know what, David? There are some times when I gather all this information, I've got to make a decision, and you may not like the answer because there's no way I can make everybody happy. And by the way, if I do something different, and I don't know how often it'll happen, but if I make a decision different than you recommended, I owe it to you to explain why I'm doing it, okay? But this is not going to be a democracy. And by the way, if you've got a serious problem with it, I will respect that, and I'll help you find a job someplace else. And by the way, I bring this all up, David, before there's an incident. See, because then once there's an incident and you say to Tim, hey, Tim, Harry said he wanted to know. Tim's going to say, yeah, but remember he said he'd always listen, but he said we're not going to make everybody happy. And part of the problem we have now, David, I've been teasing on this one in the class a lot. You'll appreciate this one. There's a lot of leaders who actually believe they're going to make everybody happy. Well, guess what? It's not going to happen. And the crazy example I've been using lately, David, out of presidential elections, and I had to look at this, it turns out, in the last 30, 40 years, every one of them, 51-49, 52-48. I was telling the students the other day, I believe the last biggest landslide may have been Ronald Reagan's second term in 1984, I think. And I think in that landslide, he got like 65% to 35. And I told the students, think about that. In the biggest landslide, David, 1/3 of the people truly don't like you. They truly don't like you. Okay, so get over it, all right? But listen, St. Francis, seek to understand before you're understood. I care a lot about what you said, but there is no way I'm going to make everybody happy. I'm just not going to be able to do it.
One of the things I genuinely appreciate about you, Harry, you're with your seasoning, with all that you've done, you still seem to have an insatiable appetite to learn and grow and continue to evolve as a manager, as a leader, as an executive. In thinking about your journey, and you were kind enough to bring up curve benders, you and I have talked about individuals that come into our lives that beyond our short-term performance executional results, Harry, leave an indelible imprint on the manager, the leader, the human being that we become. So not just here's a product or service or the market we serve, but here's how I want you to become more empathetic, more compassionate leader. Can you think about your own journey and maybe share one or two individuals that had that impact on you?
Sure. And I've been very, very blessed. boy, I'll just give you a couple of them. One of them is my grandfather, who literally was a history teacher in Queens, New York for 50 years. And I can remember being 5 or 6 years old, and he'd be walking me up and down Jamaica Avenue, talking about Napoleon, talking about Julius Caesar, talking about history. And Harry, you're here for a short period of time. What difference do you want to make? How do you want to make a difference? Had an enormous impact. I had an uncle that I've written about who was a priest. And at one point in time, I thought, oh, well, we probably need more ministers and priests. Maybe I should do that. And he said, Harry, if you don't have a calling for that, you can reach people that don't come to church or a mosque or a synagogue. And Harry, your behavior how the impact your behavior and example can have can be very, very huge. And he had an enormous impact on me. And Dean Jacobs, who's the fellow who was my professor, who when I was leaving Baxter said, you do not need to run another company. You've done that already. Okay. How about you come and teach? That's what I want you to do. And he hung up. Those are people that have an enormous impact on your life. And I could go on and on. I've got so many people that, well, as you know, Dave, we said it before. If you really believe, Chief, that you can learn something from every single person you come in contact with. I was using the example again with the students that whenever I get out of a taxi in the world's least favorite airport for me, LaGuardia Airport, okay, and you get out of there and you get in a cab and you're going to Midtown. Before that cab even gets on the expressway, I'm having a really heated discussion with the cab driver, and I learn a lot. And one of the students said, but the guy's driving a cab. And I said, well, for some reason, it seems half the cab drivers I'm driving with literally are working on their PhD at either Columbia or NYU. I mean, it's amazing. I learn more from them than I do from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. You can learn so much from every single person, okay? But you have to be wired up to be vulnerable and share ideas and share thoughts. That's the beauty of teaching.
I want to build on that. I often talk about curve benders who can have an incredible impact on your life. I think a fairly profound question is, how can we become curve benders in the lives of others? Harry, you've done that for countless others, not just the students you teach, but the employees you touched and others you're the steward of in your board work and certainly at Baxter. What do you believe are some of the attributes that it takes to become not just a great coach or a mentor or a great boss, but someone that people remember 20 years from now, 30 years from now, as having had a profound impact in the lives of others?
Wow. I think of the Chief as people that are very good listeners. They are people that genuinely want to know about you and what you want to do. That comment, my grandfather, I'm sure you've heard it, of there's a reason you got 2 ears and 1 mouth. And this whole concept of I'm going to share with you my opinion. You may feel very differently, and what you can do by your personal example, right? I mean, when I work with a student and we go into a restaurant, okay, we'll say right away to the waiter, oh, where are you from? And what are you doing? And what are you thinking about? And what's your favorite team, right? And by demonstrating how you care enough about every single person and your example, you change people's behavior in a very, very big way. And as you well know, I find the ability to relate personal stories and examples of your vulnerability, examples of when you failed, it's almost like people immediately can get attracted to that, and then they never forget that. That's why I think about it.
I love that. So you've been more than kind with the gift of your time and your insight. What's the best way for our audience to learn more about you?
Well, you can watch David Noor's podcast that we did together. And the students set up a website for me, Chief. It's just harrykraemer.org. They can follow that, and then they can actually send any emails. And I respond to every single email like you do, David. And more than happy to have discussions with anybody that's helpful. harrykraemer.org. And always, David, a great pleasure to be with you. And I wish you and your family the very best, my friend.
You're more than kind. For our audience, you've been listening to Harry Kraemer, former CEO, chairman of Baxter, clinical professor at Kellogg at Northwestern University. Harry, thank you for being our guest today.
Great to be with you, David.